So today, we're going to talk about Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and why it failed so hard. I'm going to talk about what it got right, what it got wrong, and why this is easily the most disappointing title in the Borderlands franchise. All that said, let's just dive right into the good, the bad, and the ugly of Wonderlands. The good. This game is such a frustrating topic because it actually got a lot of things right despite all of its issues. So let's get into the good stuff first, because there are definitely some things that this game did very well. Wonderlands had one of the best campaigns in the franchise. It was well-paced, engaging, and didn't overstay its welcome. Unlike BL3, which felt padded and dragged on for far too long, the Wonderlands campaign was the perfect length and had a focused narrative with a cohesive story. The characters were interesting, the world felt lived in, and the villain was intriguing. There was a strong balance between serious themes and well-placed moments of levity the franchise is known for. Character creation was a nice touch, and build diversity was taken to a whole nother level. There were so many ways to customize your playstyle, it was able to appeal to a wider range of players. Melee weapons added a new feel to the game, even if they felt more like a build modifier than actual gameplay change. They needed a bit of work, but were still fun for a first attempt. The maps have to be the most beautiful in the franchise, and the designers at Gearbox should be commended for their work. It was very easy to get lost in the details of the environment, and it did an excellent job of immersing you into the new world. Each location felt unique, but still connected, and most were absolutely massive. Sound effects were also much improved. They helped weapons feel like they had weight to them, and you got a lot of useful feedback from the surroundings with all the subtle bullet pings and smashing sounds around you. Movement mechanics were highly optimized as well. Not only did slamming, mantling, and sliding feel perfect, but the added benefit of using these skills to open chests was a great quality of life improvement. Other great additions include side missions that scaled with your character and having mission rewards available in vending machines after completion. Enchantment rerolls and items was a much loved feature as well. Plenty of vendor locations and well-placed fast travel stations helped to significantly improve map navigation and also negated the need for vehicles. Item testing was also significantly improved thanks to the new shooting range in Brighthoof, which allowed you to test damage over time for once and was wide open so you could better see how an item behaved in the real world. Having trash mobs roaming the area were also a nice addition too, further increasing your ability to improve your build quickly and with minimal downtime. Using spells in lieu of grenades was a great move. They provided many unique effects that improved build diversity, whereas grenades always felt like a nice-to-have item in previous Borderlands titles. Chaos Chambers were actually a nice endgame activity, at least for a little while. They were good ways to perfect your build since they actually required you to complete each level prior to unlocking the next. Mayhem mode in BL3 was not like that, so you could go up or down at any time. It allowed you early access to higher tier weapons even if your build or skill level wasn't ideal for the challenge. Also, having statistics at the end of each Chaos Chamber run was actually a really cool idea, and I hope they bring that back in some form for BL4's endgame when it's released. The bad. So now let's just get into how Wonderlands failed to live up to expectations. For starters, there was a new loot luck mechanic which required a player to hunt every map thoroughly for hidden dice in order to increase your chances of getting good loot drops. This was incredibly tedious and forced you to play in a completionist manner to get the best chance at getting better gear. Not everyone likes to play this way, and it felt like a cheap gimmick to get the player to spend more time in each area. Finding dice or any other set of items is not inherently bad, and versions of this have been done in previous games and done very well. But having to find 200 dice for max luck and having it tied to your drop chances was a poor decision, and seemed to punish the players for not playing a certain way that Gearbox had intended. The overworld section of the game was boring and tedious. It served to only slow down the game significantly and didn't add much to the experience. The whole idea definitely felt like a beta test of a feature Gearbox was thinking of adding to another game. Now we have to talk about the horrendous UI that this game shipped with. Borderlands games are not typically known for good user interface designs, but holy crap, was it clunky and felt like a test of the player's patience and to see how much it could slow down the gameplay. The color palette and fonts were atrocious and made reading anything a chore. Plus, it was buggy as hell. Some items wouldn't show up at all, item cards would get stuck on the screen, and moving through your backpack or bank was painful, especially when rerolling enchantments. After a single reroll, you would always be defaulted back to the first item in your backpack. This would force you to have to travel all the way down to the last item you wanted to reroll and try it again. It was so tedious and clunky, I almost never rerolled gear due to how frustrating the experience was. Additionally, while sound effects were great overall, the music in this game was not memorable and arguably the weakest in the franchise. Nothing got me hyped or added to the experience at all. In fact, most of it felt boring and the loops were very noticeable. It almost bordered on annoying. The only positive experience I had related to the music was the sea shanty that was sung during one of the missions. It was very well done and a total surprise. So on to the loot of this game, and holy crap, they did take a step back from previous entries. For starters, there wasn't nearly enough item diversity. At launch, only pistols and SMGs were viable, and there weren't a lot of fun options even from that item pool. The meta was quickly found and promptly nerfed over the next few weeks after release. And again, launchers and snipers got absolutely no attention, and shields were a joke. They were usually broken with one hit, even from trash mobs, and added almost nothing to your build or playstyle. Your choice of shield was almost arbitrary. The best ones didn't work exactly as described or even outright broke if you transitioned to a new map. The same thing happened to armor at times, and the amount of RNG-based rolls on items made almost all of them useless depending on your build and skill tree combos. This forced me to read every card multiple times and compare it to other items I had with stats that weren't usually similar. Adding suffixes to items made the description cards longer than a CVS receipt and removed your ability to quickly identify a good item from a bad one. Further complicating the matter was the inclusion of chaotic and primordial versions of the same item. Why couldn't a new rarity have been used instead? It just made identifying gear from a glance nearly impossible even after they changed the light rays to match the level of the item. Enemy diversity was another huge miss. While they may have looked different, most were just reskinned versions of pirates or skeletons you faced early in the game and had no unique mechanics. The AI was trash too. Most enemies would mindlessly charge at you in an effort to overwhelm the player, forcing you to spend most of your time running backwards trying not to get hit as your only strat to beat them. The lack of diversity also transferred over to boss fights, which felt generic and were usually tedious or outright not fun. None were memorable for anything other than frustrating mechanics, annoying immunity phases, and seemingly random elemental resistance. When I think back to BL3, there are a lot of fights that stand out as memorable for being a spectacle and fun challenge, like Genevieve, the Rampager, or Troy. You get none of that from Wonderlands. And while I think the maps in this game are beautiful and appeared massive in scale, they actually felt more restrictive than any in the franchise. No matter how big a map looked, it always felt like I was being funneled into a very narrow area to fight enemies, and it made them all feel very claustrophobic. BL3 maps that looked huge also felt so when you explored them. Eden 6, Necrotafeo, and Pandora all had plenty of locations that allowed you to feel insignificant from their size and scope. It really helped with the immersion and added to your feeling of being a unique addition to the team on your way to hunt some vaults. Also, the D&D theme this game was built on wasn't explored nearly enough in my opinion. It felt too grounded, even with environments and enemies seemingly being a good representation of the theme. I wish they just leaned harder on the imaginary aspect of it. Why couldn't it have been absolutely bonkers in some areas, like the Fuster Cluck DLC from BL3? There were parts of that DLC that felt way more creative and magical than any in Wonderlands. It almost seems like Wonderlands was just a reskin of themes that could happen in any Borderlands game. With at least half, if not more, of its mechanics and assets taken from other entries in the franchise, I expected a lot more creativity than what we got. This brings me to one of the most controversial aspects of the game, the Chaos Chambers. I already mentioned how these were a good addition and fun endgame activity. The problem is that it was the only endgame activity. It got boring quickly, even if I was running them with friends. In addition to them being boring and repetitive, they were also very time consuming and mostly randomized. That, combined with the roguelike aspect, makes them rage inducing if you die at the final boss after having spent up to 20 minutes farming. Ultimately, this weak endgame activity was the reason many stopped playing the game altogether. Why would anyone want to farm Chaos Chambers just to run more Chaos Chambers? The lack of endgame diversity really hindered this game and almost forced players into purchasing those now infamous PLCs. And don't worry, we'll get to the cash grab that was called post-launch content soon enough. Having puzzles leading to special boss fights was actually really cool, but you often died to them in the first encounter and lost your progress for that run. Many players just avoided the encounters if they were farming the runs for better gear, which turned those fights essentially into a novelty and not something you would typically do more than a few times. Also, the act of feeding bunnies at the end of the runs was so tedious I never looked forward to it. Only being able to give them 500 crystals at a time, for them to just spit them into small piles you could barely sort through, was miserable and felt like more work than a reward. I would have to pick up a bunch of items and drop them around the area just to get enough room to see what new items had dropped so I didn't miss anything. I did, however, like the fact you could choose what items you wanted to farm for as opposed to it being totally random, so that was kind of nice. One last thing about the Chaos Chambers that might be a nitpick on my part was how you ended each encounter. Having the whole screen flash a cloud animation hurt my eyes and also made me think my shield had just been broken, which in this game usually results in dying. I never got used to it and thought it was just another item on the list of poor feedback mechanics that were implemented. Lastly, we should mention the hotfixes and patches that occurred during the short lifespan of this game. Most of them were very weak and didn't address major issues the community noticed, which was not how BL3 was usually handled in the past. Sometimes issues were fixed one week, then broken on subsequent hotfixes only to be pushed off until a very large patch was released. This meant that there were playability issues left broken for weeks at a time and ultimately led to a lot of frustrated players outright abandoning the game. Not all were game breaking, but most were annoying and made the game even more tedious than it already was. Gearbox just always seemed to be 2 to 3 weeks behind on fixing anything and would almost never address major concerns expressed by the community. Additionally, every single tweet about this game or upcoming events was absolutely tone deaf and seemed to be trying to sell us something or act like there were no issues. This was made worse by the absolutely shameful DLC release, which leads me to my final points of this game's demise. The ugly. Here we get into the really ugly aspect of this game, and it brings me no pleasure at all to harp on it, so let's just get it over with. Without a doubt, the final nail in the coffin for this game was its DLC, or henceforth referred to as PLC. It was renamed to PLC, or post-launch content, since the typical definition of DLC, adding some new missions or endgame content, didn't really seem to apply here. All of BL3's DLCs added not only new items and missions, but also stories, interesting characters, and sometimes even new mechanics. Wonderlands PLCs were a joke, but Gearbox's lack of response to the community's concerns and disappointments, combined with completely tone-deaf series of tweets, just gave the impression of a company that was out of touch and displayed a hubris that was never shown during BL3's entire life cycle. It was jarring to say the least and led to some outright awkward interactions. So you have to be asking, why were these PLCs so bad? Aren't they content that adds diversity to an anemic endgame? Well, technically sure, but it was how it was implemented that got us angry. Essentially, the PLC was released in weekly stages and added a phase or new mechanic to the boss fight at the end. The problem is that each new PLC, there were 4 of them, only provided at most 10 minutes of content per month and very few new items at all. Couple that with an abysmal drop rate from the Wheel of Fate as a reward for finishing the PLC, and you had endgame content that was even less rewarding than Chaos Chambers, with the added caveat you had paid for that extra right to have such a weak experience. If all the PLC was released at the same time, I doubt many people would have had as much of an issue. The fact that Gearbox thought it was a good idea to drip feed content over a 4-week period was an insult and made many players wonder what they were actually paying for. It was unlike any other content released in the franchise and felt like a cash grab. The hub area where you entered the new content was far more interesting than the actual mirrors you had to run through. Even then, they couldn't be bothered with putting NPCs in there. There were just ghosts of NPCs that disappeared when you got too close to them. Such a half-assed effort only added to the cash grab feel of this entire game, and many players felt betrayed by a company that we have loved for many years. Conclusion. All in all, Wonderlands felt like a failed experiment, and at just 6 months old, already appears dead. In all honesty, after the first PLC release, most players abandoned ship, and many that didn't only hung around because of the goodwill that the rest of the Borderlands franchise had earned. They were willing, or hoping, to wait it out until Gearbox came to its senses and changed course. When it was clear this was not going to happen, many went back to BL2 or BL3, both games that are amazing to this day, even being 10 and 3 years old respectively. Both are supremely fun and replayable, something Wonderlands will never be. It truly makes me realize how good we had it with the past titles and makes me appreciate them even more. I just hope Gearbox learns from this failure and uses the experience to make BL4 a masterpiece. Thank you all for watching, be well, and happy farming.